September 1940. Chungking, China. 27 fighter pilots climbed into their cockpits and never came back down. 27. In one afternoon, against 13 Japanese planes, the Chinese Air Force scrambled everything they had. Soviet-built Polikarpov Y-15 biplanes, I-16 monoplanes, seasoned veterans who had been fighting in the sky over China for years. They outnumbered the Japanese attackers 2-1. They had altitude advantage. They had home territory. They had every reason to win that engagement. The fight lasted minutes, not hours. Minutes. When the smoke cleared, 27 Allied aircraft had been destroyed. 13 Japanese fighters returned to base without a single loss. A kill ratio so absolute, it looked like a fabrication. American intelligence officers who read the report assumed it was propaganda. They filed it. They forgot it. That decision, that moment of contempt disguised as analysis, would cost the United States Navy more than 2,000 aircraft and thousands of lives over the next 18 months. And it all began with one man. Not an admiral, not a general, not a politician who had spent his career learning how wars were supposed to work. A 34-year-old engineer from Gunma Prefecture who had never flown a combat mission in his life. A man who spent his days in a factory in Nagoya calculating stress loads on aluminum spars and arguing with his bosses about weight. His name was Jiro Horikoshi, and in 1937 he received a piece of paper that every other serious engineer in Japan declared physically impossible. He was going to prove them wrong, and what he built in that factory would change the Pacific War before it even officially began. The year is 1937. Japan is already at war with China, though nobody is calling it a world war yet. The Imperial Japanese Navy has been watching its pilots fight across the vast distances of the Pacific theater, and they have arrived at an uncomfortable conclusion. Their current carrier fighter, the Mitsubishi A-5M, is good. It is fast. It is agile. It is already the most maneuverable carrier aircraft in the world. But it cannot reach the fight. The Pacific Ocean is enormous in a way that maps do not communicate. The distances between islands, between fleets, between targets are staggering. A fighter that can protect a carrier task force close to home is useless if the battle is happening 400 miles away. The Navy's strategists had done the math. They needed a carrier fighter that could fly for 6 to 8 hours at cruising speed, a range exceeding 1,500 miles, a round trip from the middle of the ocean to a target and back. No fighter on Earth had that range. No carrier fighter came close. Every naval aviation program in the world operated under the same accepted constraint carrier. Fighters were slower than land-based fighters, had shorter range, climbed worse, and turned wider. This was treated as a law of nature. The Americans accepted it. The British accepted it. The Japanese Navy did not. In October 1937, the Imperial Japanese Navy issued the 12 Shy specification, a formal requirement document sent to Japan's two leading aircraft manufacturers. The specification demanded something that should not have been possible: a carrier fighter capable of 500 kilometers per hour maximum speed. A climb to 3,000 meters in 3.5 minutes. Range sufficient for an 8-hour mission. Armament including 2 20mm cannon and 2 machine guns. Full radio equipment. A wingspan narrow enough to fit on a carrier elevator. Every single requirement on that list was at or beyond the absolute limit of what aeronautical engineering in 1937 could achieve. Meeting one of them would have been impressive. Meeting all of them simultaneously in a single airframe was declared by Nakajima, one of Japan's most capable aircraft manufacturers, to be physically impossible. Their engineers studied the numbers, ran the calculations, and walked away from the competition in January 1938. At Mitsubishi, one man looked at those same numbers and saw something different. Jiro Horikoshi was born in 1903 in rural Gunma Prefecture, a mountainous region northeast of Tokyo. He grew up in a Japan that was watching the world reorganize itself around industrial and military power. By the time he was old enough to choose a direction, the sky had become the frontier where national futures were being decided. He enrolled at the University of Tokyo in the engineering department and graduated in 1927 from the newly established aviation laboratory, one of the first cohorts in Japan trained specifically for aircraft design. He joined Mitsubishi immediately. His first project was a prototype carrier fighter called the 1MF-10. It flew. It flew poorly. The landing gear was structurally weak. The handling was dangerous. The project was cancelled. A different engineer might have experienced that failure as damage to his reputation. Horikoshi treated it as a course correction. Every flaw in the 1MF-10 became a lesson fed directly into his next design. That next design was the A-5M, the carrier fighter the Navy was now asking him to replace. Horikoshi had built the A-5M from the ground up. A clean, low-winged monoplane with an open cockpit and fixed landing gear, it was light-fast and extraordinarily maneuverable. Japanese pilots flying it against Chinese Air Force fighters over the Sino-Japanese War reported decisive advantages. The A-5M could outturn anything it faced in the sky over China. It established Horikoshi's reputation as the foremost fighter designer in Japan. When the impossible specification arrived, the Navy did not wonder who should lead the project. But Mitsubishi's business side hesitated. The company already had a Navy bomber contract demanding full resources. The executives considered rejecting the fighter specification entirely. The risk was significant. Building a prototype that failed would waste money and engineers. Building one that succeeded would require resources they did not have. Horikoshi pressed hard. He told his management that the weight problem, the fundamental physical contradiction at the heart of the specification, had a solution. It was extreme. It was unprecedented. But it was not impossible. The management gave him the team. The bomber project was shelved. He stood in the Nagoya works with his design team and confronted the central problem directly. The specification demanded performance. Performance required power. Power required engines. Engines weighed thousands of pounds. But Japanese aero engines in the late 1930s produced 20 to 30% less power than their American and European equivalents. Horikoshi himself acknowledged this gap without apology. The engineering reality was simple. He could not close the engine power deficit. He could not build a more powerful engine. What he could do, what he had to do, was build an airframe so light that the engine's disadvantage became irrelevant. He began removing weight from the design with a discipline that bordered on obsession. He specified a new aluminum alloy called Extra Super Duralumin designation. T7178, stronger than standard aircraft aluminum, which allowed thinner structural members throughout the entire airframe. Thinner ribs, thinner spars, thinner skin. Every joint, every bracket, every fastener examined and minimized. The wings were built using a continuous spar design, with fuel tanks integrated directly into the wing structure, eliminating the weight of separate tank housings entirely. The fuselage was assembled in two major sections, joined by a ring of 80 bolts, a construction method that simplified manufacturing and reduced weight simultaneously. Then he made the decision that would define both the triumph and the catastrophe of the machine he was building. He removed the armor. No steel plate behind the pilot's seat. No protection around the fuel tanks. No self-sealing bladders to close bullet holes and stop fuel leaks. Every Western fighter under development in 1938 was adding these features as standard. The Americans were adding them. The Germans were adding them. Horikoshi removed them before they were ever installed. His reasoning was not reckless. It was precise. Armor added weight. Self-sealing tanks added weight. Every kilogram of protection was a kilogram that slowed the aircraft, reduced its range, degraded its climb rate. A fighter that cannot be hit does not need armor. And a fighter this fast, this agile, this impossible to track. In a turning fight, a fighter like the one he was designing would not be hit. The gamble was enormous. The logic was sound. And in 1939, on April 1st, the first prototype lifted off the runway at Kagamigahara Airfield near Nagoya. The test pilot pushed the throttle forward. The aircraft accelerated. The controls were light and responsive at every speed. The rate of climb was extraordinary. Maximum speed in testing reached 331 miles per hour at 15,000 feet. The aircraft climbed to 9,800 feet in 3 minutes and 30 seconds, meeting the Navy's most demanding requirement almost exactly. Its range with an external fuel tank exceeded 1,600 miles. No carrier-based fighter anywhere in the world approached those numbers. The aircraft that Nakajima had declared physically impossible was real, and it was flying, and it was everything the specification had demanded. The Navy accepted it for service in July 1940, the Japanese year 2600. The last 2 digits of that year gave it its official designation, Navy Type Zero Carrier Fighter. The pilots called it Ryzen. The world would call it the Zero. 2 months after it entered service, 13 of them flew escort over Chungking and destroyed 27 Allied fighters without losing a single aircraft. The reports reached Washington. The analysts filed them under fabrication. But in Nagoya, in a factory that still smelled of aluminum shavings and engine oil, Jiro Horikoshi already knew what he had built. He also knew something that nobody in Washington, nobody in London, nobody in the Allied intelligence apparatus had begun to understand. The Zero was not just a fighter. It was a declaration. A proof written in aluminum and blood that the Pacific was about to become a very different war than anyone had planned for. And in December 1941, the world was about to find out exactly how different. In Part 1, we met Jiro Horikoshi, a 34-year-old engineer from Nagoya who took an impossible specification and built the most dominant carrier fighter the world had ever seen. The Zero entered service in July 1940. 2 months later, 13 of them annihilated 27 Allied fighters over Chungking without losing a single aircraft. The reports reached Washington. The analysts dismissed them. But here is what nobody told you about those reports. Claire Chennault, the American military advisor commanding the Chinese Air Force, didn't just file a report. He sent urgent, specific, detailed warnings to Washington, describing exactly what the Zero could do, its speed, its range, its kill ratio. He sent them repeatedly, and every single time the response was the same. Silence. Bureaucratic contempt dressed up as professional skepticism. 12,000 Allied airmen would pay for that silence with their lives before anyone in Washington admitted they had been wrong. And this is where everything gets worse. Because the Zero's greatest enemy in late 1940 wasn't an American fighter pilot. It wasn't a new Allied aircraft. It was a problem Horikoshi had anticipated, but never fully solved, a vulnerability he had built directly into the aircraft's DNA, embedded in every gram of weight he had removed. And by December 1941, that vulnerability was about to be exposed on the largest possible stage. After the Chungking engagement, the Imperial Japanese Navy was not celebrating quietly. Senior commanders who had spent their careers skeptical of Horikoshi's weight reduction philosophy were now reading combat reports that made no sense by conventional aviation doctrine. A carrier fighter with the range of a medium bomber. An aircraft that outturned land-based opposition. Numbers that shouldn't have been possible. Vice Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto read those reports carefully. Yamamoto was not a man who confused institutional pride with strategic reality. He had spent time in the United States. He had studied American industrial capacity firsthand and come away from that experience with a very specific conclusion: Japan could not win a prolonged war against American production. The only possibility of success was a devastating, paralyzing first strike that would shatter American will before American factories could mobilize. For that strategy to work, the Zero was not a useful tool. It was the essential tool. Yamamoto summoned his air staff. He looked at the Chungking numbers. Then he looked at the charts showing American carrier strength in the Pacific. Then he made a decision that would define the next 4 years of the war. "We attack Pearl Harbor," he said, "and the Zero leads the way." In the Nagoya works, Horikoshi heard about the Pearl Harbor planning through the filtered channels available to a civilian engineer. He did not celebrate. His diary entries from this period reveal a man who understood exactly what was being decided, not just tactically, but historically. He wrote that he had designed the Zero because the engineering problem consumed him. because the physics demanded a solution, and he had found one. He had not designed it to start a war that Japan, by his own calculation, could not win. But the machine existed. The Navy had it. And what happens to machines when wars begin is not decided by the engineers who build them. On December 7, 1941, 6 Japanese carriers launched 420 aircraft toward Pearl Harbor. Among them were 126 A6M-20s, flying fighter escort and strafing missions. The attack was coordinated across 5 theaters simultaneously: the Philippines, Malaya, Wake Island, Guam, Hong Kong, all struck within hours of each other. The results were catastrophic for the Allies. Over Pearl Harbor, the Zeros swept the sky. American fighters that managed to get airborne were outclassed and destroyed before they could reach combat altitude. Over the Philippines, Japanese Zeros caught most of the United States Army Air Force's Far East Air Force on the ground and destroyed them before they could respond. Over Malaya, Brewster Buffaloes, the aircraft Britain had sent as frontline fighters, were torn apart by Zeros that turned inside them at every speed and altitude. In the first 6 months of the Pacific War, the Zero achieved a kill ratio that military historians now estimate at approximately 12-1. 12 Allied aircraft destroyed for every Zero lost. The fighter owned the sky from Hawaii to Ceylon. But Horikoshi's bargain was already collecting its debt. The armor he had removed to save weight, the steel plate that would have sat behind the pilot's seat, the self-sealing bladders that would have closed bullet holes in the fuel tanks that, absent protection, was killing Japanese pilots every time an Allied gunner got lucky. A burst of machine gun fire that would damage an American Wildcat and allow the pilot to nurse the aircraft home would instead ignite a Zero's exposed fuel tank and kill the pilot instantly. The Zero was a sword with no shield. As long as it held the initiative, as long as it attacked from above, and dictated the terms of every engagement, the sword was enough. But wars do not stay on the attacker's terms forever. The first crack appeared not from a new aircraft, but from a new idea. Lieutenant Commander John Thach had been studying the intelligence reports from China before Pearl Harbor, the same reports the analysts had dismissed. He believed them. He spent months developing a 2-plane defensive tactic designed specifically to neutralize the Zero's turning advantage without requiring an aircraft that could match it in a turning fight. The concept was simple and brutal. Never turn with a Zero. Never engage at low speed. 2 fighters fly in a weaving pattern. When a Zero attacks one, the other turns into the attacker and fires. The Zero's own turning radius becomes a liability by the time it tracks the first target. It has exposed itself to the second fighter's guns. Thach called it the beam defense. Everyone else called it the Thach weave. At the Battle of Midway in June 1942, Thach used it in combat for the first time. His flight of 6 Wildcats faced overwhelming numbers of Zeros. By conventional doctrine, they should have been destroyed. Instead, the weave worked exactly as designed. Zeros that had been unstoppable for 6 months suddenly found themselves on the defensive, unable to close for a killing shot without flying through a crossfire. The tactic spread through the fleet immediately. But the intelligence breakthrough came from an entirely unexpected source. On June 4, 1942, the same day, Midway began a 19-year-old Japanese pilot named Tadaoshi Koga was attacking the American base at Dutch Harbor in the Aleutian Islands. Ground fire severed his Zero's oil line. He attempted an emergency landing on a Kutan island. The aircraft flipped on soft, marshy ground. Koga was killed instantly. The airframe was nearly intact. American forces recovered it a month later. They shipped it to North Island Naval Air Station in San Diego. The finest test pilots in the United States Navy flew it. For the first time, American engineers measured the Zero's exact performance envelope, not estimated, not guessed, not extrapolated from combat reports filed by men under fire. Precise numbers at every altitude and airspeed. The diagnosis was complete. The Zero was superior in low-speed turning and rate of climb. It was inferior in high-speed dives in roll rate above 200 knots and in structural integrity under negative G loads. push the nose down, and accelerate past 200 knots, and the Zero's ailerons became sluggish and unresponsive, a consequence of the same lightweight construction that made it so agile at slower speeds. The prescription was clear: dive, accelerate, fire once, extend away. Never under any circumstances turn with it. Grumman was already building the answer before the captured Zero was even flown. The F-6F Hellcat had been in development since early 1942, designed around everything American combat pilots had reported about the Zero's weaknesses. When the Akutan Zero's test data arrived, Grumman engineers incorporated every measurement into the Hellcat's final specifications. The Hellcat weighed more than the Zero. It was armored. It had self-sealing fuel tanks. Its engine produced 2,000 horsepower, more than double the Zero's power. At high speed, it rolled faster. In a dive, it accelerated faster. And when enemy fire hit it, the pilot had a reasonable chance of flying home. The Hellcat entered service in the Pacific in mid-1943. The first major engagement involving large numbers of Hellcats produced results that inverted everything the first year of the war had established. Japanese pilots who had learned their tactics in a Zero that owned the sky were now flying the same aircraft against opponents who had studied every weakness the Akutan aircraft had revealed. The kill ratio that had been 12-1 in Japan's favor was reversing with frightening speed. And in Nagoya, Horikoshi already knew it. He had begun work on successors in 1942, a land-based interceptor designated the J-2M Raiden, and a new carrier fighter called the A-7M Repu that was intended to replace the Zero entirely. He understood that the Zero's design philosophy had reached its limit. The weight reduction approach that had produced the finest carrier fighter of 1940 could not be pushed further. What the next generation of aircraft needed was not a lighter airframe, but a fundamentally more powerful engine. Japan did not have one. The engine gap that Horikoshi had worked around in 1938 by building an impossibly light airframe had not closed. It had widened. American engine technology had advanced aggressively through 2 years of wartime production. Japanese engine development had stalled. The industrial base that Horikoshi needed to build the next Zero was being systematically dismantled, not by combat, but by American submarines cutting off the raw material supply lines that fed every Japanese factory. The Zero would not be replaced in time. Horikoshi knew it. Japan's senior commanders knew it. But knowing something and stopping it are entirely different problems. In 1944, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, American fighters and anti-aircraft fire would destroy approximately 550 Japanese aircraft in 2 days. American pilots would call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Zeros in that battle were the same aircraft that had ruled the Pacific in 1941. The pilots flying them had weeks of training where their predecessors had had years. That story belongs to Part 3. But first consider what Horikoshi built and what it cost, and ask yourself whether genius and tragedy can live inside the same decision. Because in 1944, the answer was about to become impossible to ignore. In Part 1, Jiro Horikoshi built the impossible, a carrier fighter with the range of a medium bomber and the agility of a racing plane. In Part 2, that fighter swept the Pacific sky for 6 months at a kill ratio of 12-1 until American engineers flew a captured Zero in San Diego and extracted every weakness from its aluminum bones. The Hellcat was coming. The Thak weave was spreading through the fleet. The tide was turning. But here is what the history books skip past too quickly. Between the moment American engineers understood the Zero and the moment American pilots destroyed them in numbers, there was a gap. Months of combat where Japanese pilots who had mastered the Zero faced opponents who now knew exactly how to kill it. The transition was not clean. It was not sudden. It was a grinding, brutal reckoning played out across 10,000 miles of Pacific sky. And the numbers from that reckoning are staggering. By the time the Battle of the Philippine Sea arrived in June 1944, Japan had lost something more irreplaceable than aircraft. The pilots who had perfected the Zero's capabilities over China, over Pearl Harbor, over the Dutch East Indies, the men with 3 and 4 years of combat experience, were gone. Killed at Midway. Killed at Guadalcanal. killed in the grinding air war over the Solomon Islands that consumed veteran aircrew faster than Japan's training programs could replace them. The Zero, flying over the Philippine Sea in 1944, was the same aircraft that had dominated in 1941. The pilot inside it had weeks of training where his predecessor had had years. And this is where everything collapsed. When American intelligence first began piecing together the scale of Japanese pilot losses through 1942 and 1943, the picture was almost unbelievable. Japan's pre-war naval aviation had trained approximately 3,500 carrier-qualified pilots. By the end of the Guadalcanal campaign alone, that number had been cut by more than half. The men who could not be replaced were not just pilots. They were institutional knowledge, muscle memory, the accumulated experience of 10,000 hours in the cockpit of a machine that required mastery to survive in. Japanese Naval Command recognized the crisis. Their response was to accelerate training programs, cutting the required hours before a pilot was declared combat ready from 340 hours to 150. Then to 100, then lower. The mathematics of that decision were catastrophic, and everyone involved knew it. A pilot with 100 hours in a Zero did not know its limits. He did not know the precise airspeed at which the ailerons stiffened and the aircraft became difficult to roll. He did not know the negative G behavior that made a diving escape dangerous. He knew how to take off and land. In combat against a Hellcat pilot with 400 hours, he was not a combatant. He was a target. But this was not the only crisis Horikoshi's design was facing. The Zero's production had continued at Mitsubishi's Nagoya works and at Nakajima's facilities through 1943 and into 1944, but the supply chain feeding those factories was hemorrhaging. American submarines operating in the Pacific had identified Japan's merchant fleet as a strategic priority and pursued it with devastating efficiency. By mid-1943, submarine attacks were sinking Japanese merchant vessels at a rate that threatened to strangle the entire industrial base. Aluminum required bauxite shipped from Southeast Asia. Bauxite ships were being sunk. Engine components required precision alloys sourced from territories increasingly cut off by American naval dominance. The Nagoya works that had assembled the Zero with extraordinary precision was now working with materials of degrading quality, sourced through supply chains that were being systematically destroyed. Horikoshi watched it from his design office. He was already deep into the J-2M Raiden Interceptor and the A-7M Reppu, the aircraft that was supposed to replace the Zero. The Reppu used a more powerful engine and incorporated everything learned from combat about what the Zero lacked. Armor, self-sealing tanks, higher speed at altitude. He knew the Zero was finished as a competitive frontline fighter. The question was whether the Reppu could reach production before the war decided itself. The engine Japan needed for the Reppu did not perform reliably on the test stand. The Mitsubishi Mk9A produced enough power on paper. In practice, it ran hot, vibrated dangerously, and required maintenance intervals that a wartime production schedule could not support. Every month, the engine problems delayed. The Reppu was another month the Zero remained in frontline service against aircraft it could no longer fight on equal terms. Then came June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea, and the complete catastrophic, irreversible answer. The Imperial Japanese Navy committed 9 carriers and approximately 430 aircraft to the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The strategic logic was sound. If they could destroy the American carrier force supporting the Marianas invasion, they could reverse the entire momentum of the Pacific War. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa believed his aircraft launching from beyond American strike range could destroy the American fleet before American aircraft could reach Japanese carriers. He was wrong in ways that would have been impossible to predict 18 months earlier. American radar, developed and refined through 2 years of Pacific combat, detected the incoming Japanese strikes at distances that gave American fighter direction officers time to vector Hellcats to altitude before the attack arrived. The Hellcats were waiting. Above. Fast. Armed with 6 50 caliber machine guns and the accumulated tactical knowledge of every American pilot who had survived an encounter with the Zero and lived to write a report about it. The first Japanese strike wave launched at approximately 7:30 in the morning. It consisted of 69 aircraft, including Zero's flying escort. American radar tracked it from 250 miles out. Hellcats intercepted it more than 60 miles from the American fleet. The Japanese formation was torn apart before it reached attack range. Zeros that attempted to turn and fight were met by Hellcat pilots who had been specifically trained in one response: dive, extend, do not turn. The Zero's turning advantage was neutralized by pilots who simply refused to offer it as an option. Hellcats that took hits from Japanese guns absorbed the damage and kept flying. Zeros that took hits from American guns burned. The second Japanese strike wave of 128 aircraft was intercepted and destroyed with the same efficiency. The third strike of 47 aircraft was met and shattered. A fourth strike of 82 aircraft was recalled part-way and still lost 49 planes to Hellcats waiting on the return path. By the end of June 19th, Japan had lost approximately 240 aircraft in the air. American losses were 23. The following day, American strike aircraft located the Japanese carrier force and sank 2 additional carriers and destroyed more than 60 aircraft. Total Japanese losses across both days reached approximately 550 aircraft destroyed, 3 carriers sunk, and most of Japan's remaining experienced aviators dead in the Philippine Sea. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The name is glib. The reality it describes is a complete and irreversible collapse of Japanese naval air power. Saburo Sakai, Japan's leading surviving ace, with 64 credited victories, was not at the Philippine Sea. He would survive the war. But he understood what the battle meant. He had watched the Zero go from the most feared fighter in the Pacific to a machine that younger pilots were dying in because they had not been given the time or training to understand its limits. He wrote afterward that the Zero itself was not defeated. The system that used it was defeated. The Zero was the last victim of its own success, a machine so dominant in its early period that Japan had never built the industrial and training infrastructure to replace it when the time came. The time had come. There was no replacement. After the Philippine Sea, the strategic situation was irreversible, and Japanese high command knew it. What they announced publicly and what they planned privately were 2 entirely different things. Beginning in October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Japanese Navy activated the Special Attack Units, the Kamikaze program. Zeros were stripped of their guns in some configurations, loaded with 550-pound bombs, and flown by volunteers on one-way missions into American ships. The aircraft Horikoshi had designed to outperform every opponent in the sky was now being used as a guided missile. Between October 1944 and August 1945, kamikaze attacks sank 34 American ships and damaged nearly 400 others. They killed approximately 4,700 American sailors. They were the most effective anti-ship weapon Japan deployed in the final year of the war. Not because they were the best weapon available, but because they were the only weapon left that could guarantee reaching the target. More Zeros were expended in kamikaze attacks than any other aircraft type. Horikoshi's diary from this period reveals a man in a particular kind of anguish that has no clean name. He had not designed the Zero to be thrown away. He had designed it as a demonstration of what engineering could accomplish, when the only question asked of every component was whether it was necessary. He had built the lightest, most agile, most capable carrier fighter the world had produced. And the war had taken that machine and fed it into a strategy of desperation that reduced it to a bomb with wings. He wrote that Japan was being driven to doom. He wrote that he and his colleagues had believed the government would find a diplomatic solution before the situation became catastrophic. He wrote these things in a private diary he had no reason to believe anyone would ever read. The man who built the instrument of Japan's greatest aerial victories was watching it consumed in the fires of Japan's greatest defeat, and he could not stop it. And he could not look away. The Zero's story was almost over. But Horikoshi's story had one more chapter. And what happened to him after the war ended? What he built, what he wrote, what he left behind is the part of this story that nobody tells. That chapter belongs to part 4. 4 parts. 4 hours of history. Let us bring it home. Jiro Horikoshi took an impossible specification in 1937 and built a fighter that should not have existed. The Zero dominated the Pacific for 6 months at a kill ratio of 12-1. Then American engineers flew a captured Zero in San Diego, extracted every weakness from its design, and built the Hellcat to exploit them. At the Philippine Sea in June 1944, 550 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in 2 days. The machine Horikoshi built to rule the sky ended its war being crashed deliberately into American ships. But here is the question nobody asks afterward. What happened to the man who built it? And what did he do with the rest of his life? Once the war that consumed his creation was finally over, the answer has a twist. And it is not the twist you are expecting. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. The bombing had been total. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe burned to rubble by American incendiary raids that killed more civilians than the atomic weapons dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Mitsubishi Nagoya works, where Horikoshi had spent his career calculating stress loads on aluminum spars, had been a priority target for B-29 raids. The factory that built the Zero was systematically destroyed from the air. American occupation forces arrived and moved immediately against the industrial structures that had powered Japan's war machine. The Zaibatsu, the massive industrial conglomerates that had built Japan's military capacity, were the first target. In 1946, the Allied occupation government ordered the dissolution of the Mitsubishi Zaibatsu. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries was broken into 3 separate entities, and aircraft production was forbidden entirely. Horikoshi was 42 years old. He had spent his entire adult life designing aircraft. He was the most accomplished fighter designer in Japanese history, and he was now prohibited from designing aircraft in a country prohibited from building them. He waited. He taught. He wrote. He lectured at universities across Japan on aeronautical engineering theory, passing to the next generation the accumulated knowledge of a career that had produced 11,000 aircraft. He was patient in the way that serious engineers are patient, not passive, but methodical, trusting that the problem would eventually present itself again. The occupation ended in 1952. The ban on aviation development lifted gradually. When a Japanese government consortium formed to design the country's first post-war commercial aircraft, Horikoshi was among the engineers invited to participate. The project produced the NAMCYS-11, a twin-turboprop regional airliner that entered service in 1965. More than 180 were built. Airlines across Asia, South America, and the Pacific flew them for decades. The aircraft proved that Japanese aviation engineering had not been destroyed by the war and the occupation. It had only been interrupted. In 1970, Horikoshi published his memoir. He wrote it with the precision of a man who had spent his life measuring things exactly. The book documented the Zero's development from the first impossible specification to the last production model. The engineering decisions, the weight calculations, the compromises, the moments of breakthrough. He did not sensationalize any of it. He did not apologize for any of it. He described what he had done and why he had done it, and he let the reader draw conclusions about what those decisions had cost. The book was translated into English in 1981 under the title Eagles of Mitsubishi. It became required reading for aviation historians and aircraft designers who wanted to understand how a nation with inferior engine technology had produced the finest carrier fighter of its era. In the autumn of 1973, the Japanese government awarded Horikoshi the Order of the Rising Sun Third Class for his contributions to aviation. He accepted it quietly. He was 70 years old. On January 11, 1982, Jiro Horikoshi died of pneumonia in a Tokyo hospital. He was 78. His obituary appeared in the Washington Post and the New York Times. He left behind 5 children. None of them became engineers. But his legacy did not die with him. And understanding that legacy requires stepping back from the Zero itself and looking at what it actually demonstrated, not about combat aircraft, but about the nature of engineering under extreme constraint. The Zero's design philosophy was absorbed into aviation engineering permanently. The lesson was not that you should remove armor from fighters. That specific decision was proven catastrophically wrong by 1943. The lesson was the discipline behind the decision. Horikoshi's method of interrogating every component, asking of every rivet, every bracket, every structural member whether it was truly necessary, became a foundational principle of lightweight structural design that extended far beyond military aviation. The extra super duralumin alloy, T7178, that Horikoshi specified for the Zero's airframe was a direct ancestor of the high-strength aluminum alloys that became standard in post-war aircraft manufacturing worldwide. The integrated fuel tank design, built into the wing structure, which Horikoshi used to eliminate the weight of separate tank housings, became universal in jet aircraft design. The two-section fuselage assembly, joined by a bolt ring, which simplified manufacturing and reduced weight, simultaneously influenced aircraft production methods across the industry for decades. The engineers who had built the Zero did not disappear after 1945. They became the foundation of Japan's post-war industrial renaissance. The same Nagoya works that assembled 11,000 Zeros was converted first to civilian manufacturing buses, scooters, three-wheeled cargo vehicles, and eventually to automobile production. The weight reduction obsession that had defined Horikoshi's approach to fighter design transferred directly into automotive engineering. Mitsubishi Motors formally spun off as an independent company in 1970, built vehicles that reflected the Zero's engineering DNA in ways that were not accidental. The Lancer Evolution, one of the most successful rally cars in history, was built around the same principles Horikoshi had applied in 1938. Eliminate unnecessary weight. Maximize structural efficiency. Ask of every component whether it is truly needed. The Pajero dominated the Dakar Rally for the same reasons. Rugged. Light. Engineered past what competitors believed was achievable. The institutional knowledge of a generation of engineers who had built the most capable carrier fighter in the world became the competitive advantage of a Japanese automotive industry that astonished the world through the 1970s and 1980s. The connection is not metaphorical. It is direct, documented, and traceable through the careers of specific engineers who moved from aircraft design to automobile design in the years after the occupation ended. By the early 2000s, the companies descended from Horikoshi's Mitsubishi were generating combined revenues measured in hundreds of billions of dollars. The three-diamond logo appeared on gas turbines, satellite systems, naval destroyers, rocket launch vehicles, air conditioners, and automobile dashboards across 6 continents. The company Yataro Iwasaki had founded as a shipping venture in 1870, had survived imperial expansion. Total war, atomic destruction, foreign occupation, corporate dismemberment by government decree, and economic rebirth. It employed more than 1 million people worldwide. And here is the detail that most people do not know. The part that closes the circle in a way that Horikoshi himself would have recognized as fitting. In 2013, the Japanese filmmaker Hayao Miyazaki, creator of some of the most celebrated animated films in history, released The Wind Rises, a fictionalized account of Horikoshi's life. Miyazaki had grown up in a Japan that owed its post-war prosperity partly to the engineering culture Horikoshi had helped establish. His father had worked in aviation manufacturing during the war. The film was personal. The Wind Rises portrayed Horikoshi not as a weapons designer or a military figure, but as a dreamer, a man consumed by the beauty of flight and haunted by the destruction his creations enabled. The film showed him designing not because he believed in the war, but because the engineering problem was beautiful, and he could not leave a beautiful problem unsolved. The film won the Academy Award nomination for Best Animated Feature. It was seen by millions of people worldwide who had never heard of Jiro Horikoshi. It made him famous again, 31 years after his death, in a way that his memoir and his technical papers and his Order of the Rising Sun had not. And the question the film left hanging, the question Miyazaki refused to answer, simply was the same question Horikoshi had lived with for 40 years after the war ended. What is the engineer's responsibility for what his creation becomes? If you build the sword, are you responsible for where it is swung? Horikoshi did not answer that question publicly. His diary answered it privately. He had designed the Zero because the engineering consumed him, because a specification existed that declared itself impossible and he could see a way through. He had not designed it to start a war he believed Japan could not survive. He had not designed it to be crashed into American ships by teenage boys who had been told their deaths would save their country. He built it because it was the most demanding engineering problem of his era, and he was the best person alive to solve it. That is both his defense and his indictment, and both are completely true simultaneously. 10,939 Zeros were built between 1939 and 1945. The fighter that Nakajima had declared physically impossible became the most produced Japanese aircraft of the entire war. It dominated the Pacific for 6 months at ratios that military historians still consider remarkable. It ended its service life as a weapon of desperation expended in attacks that killed nearly 5,000 American sailors. The same engineering discipline that produced the Zero produced the YS-11 airliner. The same institutional knowledge produced the Lancer Evolution. The same culture produced the gas turbines and rocket launch vehicles that Mitsubishi Heavy Industries builds today. The machines changed. The habit did not. From a factory in Nagoya, from a design office where a 34-year-old engineer asked of every component whether it was truly necessary, came a fighter that ruled the Pacific sky. And then from the ruins of the war that fighter helped begin came a lesson that outlasted every aircraft, every battle, and every admiral who had declared the specification impossible. The lesson was not about weight. It was not about aluminum alloys or wing spars or self-sealing fuel tanks. The lesson was about what happens when one person refuses to accept that a problem cannot be solved and asks instead what the solution requires. Jiro Horikoshi looked at an impossible specification and saw a way through. Everything else followed from that moment. The Zero, the war, the industry, the cars, the rockets, the million employees, the hundreds of billions in revenue. All of it traced back to one engineer in one factory asking one question of every gram of aluminum in his design. Where can I remove weight? That question changed the Pacific War. And the discipline behind it, the refusal to accept inherited assumptions about what is and is not achievable, is the only engineering principle that has ever mattered. If you have spent 90 minutes watching this series and you take one thing forward, let it be this. The people who declared the specification impossible were not stupid. They were experienced. They were rational. They were applying everything they knew to a problem and concluding correctly that it exceeded the known limits of their field. Horikoshi exceeded the known limits anyway. That is why we still tell this story.